Jack Taylor, 25, single, and a young man with plans.
Jack had a lot of confidence, and he knew what he wanted to do in life, and he went out there and done it.
After midnight, Jack left this club and decided to do something he may never have done before: make a date with a man.
Within 36 hours of this meeting, in the early hours of the morning, Jack Taylor was found dead.
We knew something had happened to Jack, and we just didn't know where to start.
Jack had been murdered by Stephen Port.
Are you telling us the truth, Stephen?
I'm telling you the truth, yes.
He was lying. He'd already killed 4 times.
People started turning up dead.
It's just a sexual predator in every which way. Unfortunately, it resulted in the deaths of 4 men.
How to catch and convict the predator serial killer. As detectives piece together the evidence, they form a picture of a suspect. Which part of the puzzle will reveal Stephen Port? What would be the killer's mistake?
Stephen Port, I don't really like saying his name, to be completely honest with you. He's ruined our lives. He's ruined our family. He's took our Jack away.
Stephen Port would spend hours in a police interview room denying his crimes, refusing to accept that evidence of his online behaviour incriminated him in multiple murders.
No, just generally looking for general porn.
It had taken 18 months before Port was arrested in connection with the death of 4 men.
Were you involved in administering any drugs or poisons or noxious substances to him?
No, I don't administer drugs to anyone or give drugs to anyone.
At first, detectives refused to accept that there had even been murders, but the sisters of Port's 4th victim, Jack Taylor, would not accept that their brother had died of an overdose, as the investigators had said. How could he have? Jack did not do drugs.
We asked the police about the syringe that was found on Jack, and it wasn't used. So you're telling us it wasn't used, but you're also telling us that he just sat there and injected himself and done an overdose.
Jack's was one of a series of bodies found in or near the ancient grounds of this church in Barking, northeast London. Like a string of other young men, he had spent time in the home of Stephen Port, a man who disguised himself as he trapped his victims.
We know that Stephen uses the dating apps available to the gay community extensively, but not just that. We know that he uses them with false identities.
Port rehearsed how he would kill, arranging a series of early hookups via the web. He would vary which sites he visited.
He is using another site called FitLads, and through that he meets a young Muslim man who'd never taken drugs or drunk alcohol in his entire life. The man is plied with poppers and says that he fell unconscious, and when he came round, Port gave him a drink, some clear liquid to drink, which he said was water, but he thought was perhaps something else. It again tasted slightly funny. Not only did the water taste a bit funny, but he felt a bit funny. He said he felt like he was partially paralysed, and he realised that his underwear had been removed. Now, he didn't want to involve the police or to report this to anybody because he didn't know what his family would make of revealing his sexuality, which he hadn't.
As bad as the experience had been, the young man was lucky to escape. He may well have been the last of Port's visitors to leave his flat alive.
Just 10 days after this encounter, Port books an escort on a site called Sleepy Boys, and he offers £800 for a young 23-year-old man to sleep with him for the night.
The man was called Anthony Walgate, a fashion student from Hull.
The appointment made with Walgate by Port was for the 17th, the night of the 17th of June 2014.
What would be his fate? Port described his version of events to Cody Lackey, an ex-con himself who befriended Port. In handwritten letters from his cell whilst awaiting trial, Stephen Port graphically told his pen pal of the role played by chemsex drugs at his flat in Barking.
He took this guy back to his house. He was preparing drinks and stuff like that. He said that this person, the first victim, was administering his own dosage of the drug. And then he had a funny turn, as Stephen Port described it.
Port had met this guy for sex earlier that evening, had spiked him or convinced him to take a fatal dose of GHB, had sex with him. He'd become unconscious and died.
2 days later, on the 19th, Walgate is dead. Anthony Walgate's body is found propped up in a sitting position against the wall of the communal entrance of a block of flats in Barking. It's the block of flats where Stephen Port lives.
He dumped him outside his house and then phoned the police when he clearly wasn't responding.
Emergency ambulance, what's the address of the emergency?
Port, in his call to the emergency services, claimed to have simply come across the tragic scene.
Cook Street, there was a young boy who got his caps outside. I don't know.
Stephen Port tells the police that he's found him there, that he's found this young man and he thinks he must have collapsed through drugs or through some other medical calamity.
Obviously shows the guilt of the man, because anyone with any modicum of humanity and stuff would have looked after that person and stayed with them. But the fact that he ran away was an admission of guilt in my eyes.
But not in the eyes of the police. Initially, Anthony Walgate's death was not considered a murder. It was a chemsex-induced overdose called in by a man who'd simply stumbled on the victim. But a week after making the 999 call, Port was arrested for lying.
What's the explanation for this young man suddenly being found dead outside this block of flats? They do a few inquiries around it, and those inquiries will include looking at Anthony Walgate's phone billing history and trying to find out what was he doing there, why was he embarking at all. They realise through the Sleepy Boys website that he was in fact an escort, but not only that, he'd been booked for that night on the 17th of June by Stephen Port to come to those flats. Stephen Port, the very man who's phoned them up and alerted them and said, I've just found this young man outside my block of flats apparently collapsed.
The belief that the death of a young man was a byproduct of consensual sex dictated an inquiry which was not searching for evidence of a killer's mistake.
How the police viewed the possibilities of Anthony Walgate's death would have dictated in which way they investigated it and to what depth some of the investigation went. If they were looking at it as an unexplained death, but not necessarily a homicide or a sex crime, then some of the sampling and some of the scientific work that would have been done around Anthony's body would be different to that in a full-blown murder investigation. So it's possible that that is where evidence that could have tied Stephen Port to Anthony Walgate might have been missed.
Indeed, inside Port's flat, there was a mass of evidence which might have incriminated him.
That should have been looked into more, especially when they knew that he'd lied and lied and lied. That would have been enough to look into it, and had they had done that, and had they had looked at his computer and everything else that we now know that they had everything, it wouldn't just be Jack's life that was saved.
We know he had searches on there for drug rape and drug porn, things like that. What was on his phone? How many other contacts might they have found? If they went through his account on Sleepy Boys and Grindr and Fit Lads and these other sites he was using,
something else would have been uncovered. Port's video stash revealed much about his murder methods, his modus operandi.
We know that Stephen watched a lot of pornographic material where other men were being drugged and raped and abused while drugged.
None of that was uncovered by police after the death of Anthony Walgate.
It's hard to be too harsh on people who are doing their best, but you do have to ask the question as to why nobody thought that Stephen Port merited further and wider investigation at that point.
An internal police investigation would later ask the same question, but for now, Port remained unsuspected of murder, able and willing to kill again.
Stephen Port's second victim was a young gay man called Gabriel Kovari.
Gabriel Kovari was just 22 years old and he'd moved to London from Slovakia, and he started a sort of relationship with Port. He lived with him in the flat in Barking for a short period, and during that period Kovari was texting his friends and saying, "Stephen Port is not a nice guy."
Nice or not, Port was in a consensual relationship with the recently arrived Gabriel, a sexual one too. On August 28th, 70 days after the death of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Kovari was discovered dead. His body left in exactly the same position as Anthony's in St. Margaret's Church graveyard, just a stone's throw from Port's flat.
He's got sunglasses on and his upper clothing has been pulled up to expose his midriff.
The sunglasses were kept by police, but not tested for DNA. Port had successfully gambled on Gabriel's death being written off as another overdose. He was growing in confidence.
You know, it's a secluded area, but actually it's very close to the centre of Barking. You know, just brazen, really, that he would, you know, obviously the first person he left outside his house, the second person he took here not a long distance and just sort of left him. You know, this is somebody who doesn't think he's going to get caught, or isn't thinking about it, or doesn't care.
Having lived a life without crime, now aged 39, armed with the means to attract young men to his flat and to spike his victims with drugs, rendering them defenseless, Stephen Port had killed twice in 3 months, and the killing hadn't stopped.
We get this slightly delayed initiation of his violent spree, but once it starts, he revels in the sense of power, of autonomy, which he hasn't had up to this point. It's not something which is intrinsic to his nature, and it's something which has been denied him by his rejection. So the sense of power must have been intoxicating once the series has started.
Port, the killer, had left a trail of evidence suggesting he was a murderer, but was suspected at this point only of lying in a 999 call.
Where was it that they were outside us?
Cook Street.
What door number?
I don't know, I didn't look.
You said 47 before.
Yeah, so yeah, what's question?
The upshot of this is that Stephen Port is still free to carry on his activities. And those activities included, in just a few weeks, the murder of at least another 2 young men.
He had made mistakes, but which one would lead police to investigate? Stephen Port. By August 2014, the bodies of Anthony Walgate and Gabriel Kovari had been found, apparently dead from a drugs overdose, in or near this secluded graveyard. What was going on?
So what you've got now is you've got 2 young gay men found inexplicably dead with their clothing pulled up within 500 yards of each other in the same part of London, and within a few weeks of each other.
And living just yards away from where the bodies are found, Stephen Port. Local journalist Ramsey Al-Wakil would one day investigate Stephen Port's behaviour as emergency services had arrived at the scenes.
So he must have seen the body, being found and kind of, he left the guy in public, so clearly he's not that concerned about somebody coming across it. He's almost just sort of going, oh well, on to the next one.
So did you have any involvement in the death of the male that we just spoke about a short while ago, Gabriel Kovari or Gabriel Klein?
No, I did not.
It was odd for us, certainly, for there to be two deaths in a short period of time. They were both men in their 20s or 30s. We asked the police, as I think you would, if there was anything to be worried about, basically, if the public were, at risk.
The police said no. But on September 18th, 2014, just 31 days after the body of Gabriel Kovari had been found propped up against this wall, a third young man, Daniel Whitworth, was found dead.
Two deaths in sort of East London, it does happen, so I think we weren't sort of panicked at that point. When it really started looking odd for us was when the third man died, was found in the same churchyard.
Did you go with Daniel to meet people?
No, I knew he was doing the same as I was, but I'd seen him at the party and there's a brief conversation with him about it, but I've never actually engaged with him outside of the place.
Daniel Whitworth's body is found in the identical location to Gabriel Kovari. Same churchyard, the same wall, sitting up against the wall, clothing pulled up. Identical to the other bodies.
He was young, gay, and a user of dating sites. The similarities were remarkable, but a piece of evidence would emerge that would prove crucial later on.
So the difference being with Daniel Whitworth, he had a suicide note, or at least a note was found on his body in his left hand in the churchyard.
In the letter, Daniel confessed to being involved with the death of Gabriel Kovari, the second man found dead in the vicinity.
And in this note, he said that the reason he committed suicide was that he felt guilty about Gabriel, who had died while they were having sex, and he felt was on his conscience, that he had placed in the churchyard, and because he felt so bad about it, essentially, he was committing suicide in the same place in the same way. And then just almost as a PS, he said, please don't blame the guy that I was with last night. It was nothing to do with him, it's all on me.
The letter was actually written by Stephen Port. If the police had suspected foul play as the cause of the three deaths, Port might have been a suspect. Detectives could have compared his handwriting with that on the note and seen that they were the same. But they did not. Instead, it was assumed to be a genuine suicide note.
From the police perspective, while it ought to have mattered, while they ought easily to have been able to prove that this was a false trail, it was wonderful news because they not only had an explanation for Daniel Whitworth's death, but his explanation for his own death was dealing with the murder of Gabriel Kovari. And at a stroke, there were two dead bodies that were effectively explained away.
Port had got away with murder using a schoolboy trick.
The suicide note is remarkable in its naivety and its childlike qualities.
But it worked. No DNA tests were carried out on the note.
Nobody really looked behind this note to try and see if it was genuine or not. And Daniel Whitworth's case went to a coroner for an inquest, and the coroner was quite particular in asking the police officers what they had done to try to establish the provenance of this suicide note. And I think it was slightly embarrassing, really, because they said, well, we haven't really done anything. It was just a note that we found on him, and he's, we've taken it at face value.
Until further forensic and detective work was carried out on the letter, catching Stephen Port would not be possible, and it would be over a year before the letter was uncovered as a forgery. The prevailing theory seemed to be that Daniel Whitworth was the latest man found at a gay meeting site, the churchyard, who had overdosed on relaxant drugs like GHB. His was not the latest in a series of murders, because there had not been a series of murders in the estimation of the police at that stage. The press were told this was all a weird coincidence.
And I sort of thought, well, it's not that satisfying, but at least we've got an answer, which is, you know, carry on as you were, no need to avoid the graveyard. There's no serial killer on the loose. But it turns out there was a serial killer on the loose.
In March 2015, Port stood trial for the offence that he'd been accused of a year earlier, perverting the course of justice. He had claimed not to know victim number 1, Anthony Walgate, but detectives had later discovered that Anthony and Port had spent the night together before Walgate apparently overdosed from drug use. So Port had lied. He was sentenced to 8 months in prison. He spent 3 months inside, during which time bodies stopped turning up at St. Margaret's Churchyard or the roads nearby. It was in September 2015 that Jack Taylor was out with friends at the Dagenham Trades Hall Club. At 10:30, he's seen arriving at the hall, and at 12:30 he leaves. After departing from the Trades Hall, Jack calls a minicab, checks in on a dating app.
25-year-old Jack Taylor communicates with Stephen Port on Grindr, and it's 3 in the morning, but notwithstanding that, he goes over to Barking to meet him.
He heads for Cambridge Road in Barking after he and Stephen Port had agreed to meet. Nobody was yet investigating them, looking for them, but Port was leaving digital footprints.
One of the messages that they exchanged on Grindr was Port asking Taylor if he'd ever taken tea, by which Taylor assumed him to mean crystal meth, and he said, "No, I never have done, mate."
The dating apps allow people to pick partners. He has just used that to pick victims.
Shortly after 3, Port is recorded on security cameras near Cambridge Road in Barking Town Centre.
Port collects him at the railway station, meets him there, and they go back to Port's flat.
Port travels back to Cambridge Road and again is captured on camera, this time with Jack Taylor. Jack could not possibly have known how much danger he was in.
Within 36 hours of this meeting, in the early hours of the morning, Jack Taylor was found dead.
So we got a police appeal through for what we now know was Jack Taylor, Port's 4th victim. Body he was found in Barking. Not that different situation from the first 3 deaths. And I thought, you know, that's like what happened last year, you know, that's a bit odd.
Still unsuspected of being a killer, Stephen Port has claimed victim number 4. Will he be stopped before another young man is drugged and killed? What would it take to uncover the killer's mistake? For Stephen Port to be arrested for murder, police had to suspect him of involvement in the death of 4 young men, and in late 2015, they did not. Uncovering any mistake that would lead to his arrest and conviction would take a change of mind at the Metropolitan Police. Port's 4th victim and the determination of a family to get to the truth would become key to catching a killer. Jack, 25, was a forklift truck driver and very much loved by a family that lived just a few miles from Barking in Dagenham.
He was very passionate about family, always wanted to spend time with his family, his friends, loved socialising, just loved being with his family and friends all the time, just wanted to be a part of everything, didn't he?
Yeah.
It came as no surprise to his sisters that Jack had been out on that Friday the 13th of September.
Jack was very much the life and soul, and he would get on with everybody. He'd be really sociable. He was a really friendly person. Like, he was the sort of person, he walked in a room and he lit the room up. That was just the way he was.
Later that weekend, the news emerged. Jack has been found dead.
Might help if I show you a picture. We'll call this CRT 2. This is Jack Taylor. Do you recognise that, mate?
Taylor's body was found on the other side of the church wall at St Margaret's. He was propped up against the wall, sitting position, had his upper clothing pulled up to reveal his belly. Exactly the same as the other deaths in the area. In his pocket was found a syringe and a small glass medicine bottle. This was reported to local police as a suspicious or unexplained death. Police attended, and the conclusion they came to was that this death was probably self-inflicted by misuse of some sort of substances.
Not something the Taylor family were prepared to accept.
From what we were told, that there was something not right. We knew that because Jack didn't take drugs.
The Taylors became crucial to the eventual investigation into Stephen Port. There was a range of reasons why the sisters were sceptical about what they'd been told as they investigated what evidence they knew of.
We asked the police about the syringe that was found on Jack, and it wasn't used. So you're telling us it wasn't used, but you're also telling us that he just sat there and injected himself and done an overdose.
Another reason for their scepticism, the location where Jack was found.
And the fact that he was where he was when we were taken to the area, that's not somewhere Jack would ever be.
It just didn't add up. Their own internet research revealed how Jack was the fourth young man to have been found in the vicinity of the churchyard.
So we was trying to find out, like, if there was anything else that had happened around that area, anything similar. So as we started to go back, obviously that's when we came across the other boys.
With hindsight, how could it have been missed, especially knowing that they were all gay, that they were all young, they'd all used the same drug, they'd all had sex. It just seems like, you know, links should have been drawn that weren't.
Stephen Port was going about his daily life throughout this time. He worked as a cook in a cafe in East London, and he was still dating via gay sites and apps. The Taylor sisters were yet to suspect him, but they were getting near to the truth.
It was just, well, it was heart-wrenching, and we always knew that we like basically had like a big puzzle, and as we were getting more and more information and when we were putting it together, we didn't know what the middle bit was.
The local newspaper in Barking was equally sceptical. 4 gay young men found dead, each just yards from the home of a man who had reported the first death. The evidence that foul play was involved, to some, appeared clear.
When you think that there was so much linking these deaths to each other and to Stephen Port, you have to think, how smoking does a gun have to be?
Together, media and family turned to the police for explanations.
Jack Taylor's family, along with a local newspaper in Barking, kept up pressure on the Metropolitan Police to look again at Jack's death.
Other evidence struck the women. Until now, police had not suggested that the deaths of the men were linked. It was when researching the inquest into the death of Daniel Whitworth, Port's third victim in June 2015, that the remarkable similarity of the discoveries of the bodies struck the Taylors as evidence that the deaths were linked.
We then followed the coroner's report back then at what had come out, and basically it was nigh on the same as Jack.
The coroner into the death of Daniel Whitworth had also suggested more work should be done on the case. Momentum was building to look again at events surrounding the deaths near the St Margaret's graveyard.
And eventually their pressure had some sort of success in that somebody decided to get another officer who hadn't been involved before to have a look not only at Jack Taylor's deaths but at the 3 that had gone previously. And that officer was surprised, shocked by what was found, and made the suggestion that, do you know what, all these 4 deaths look like they're murders and they look like they're linked. And that was the point where the alarm is raised almost. The homicide team are involved, and all of a sudden the investigation that these offences probably should have had from the very beginning starts to take place.
Investigating officers now decided to track Jack Taylor's movements on the night before he died and checked his phone. They uncovered that he'd agreed to meet a man in Barking. They trawled through security camera images of the town. There he was. But who was he with?
And so there was a police appeal for a man who'd been with this dead guy hours before he died.
On the 13th of October 2015, the Met issued a CCTV image taken from Barking Station, which showed Jack Taylor walking with a tall, blonde man.
I think about 24 hours passed, and Stephen Port was arrested on suspicion of 4 murders.
It was now that detectives began a series of interviews with Stephen Port.
Don't recognise his face.
So you don't recognise his face?
I do not know, no.
The truth began to emerge. Taking the decision itself to consider the deaths as murder and Port as a suspect meant that any mistakes he had made might now be uncovered. The resultant publicity generated even more evidence.
After Port's arrest and charge, the media coverage of the events brought forward a horde of people making allegations about Stephen Port. They included the young Muslim boy, and it was clear that Port had a settled method of what he liked to do and what he would do, and that was to contact men normally younger than him, normally considerably younger than him, on internet or apps, and get them to come to his flat, where he would ply them with a drug, with GHB predominantly, and then also inject them with something to render them unconscious, during which time he would rape them.
He has thought through every detail of how he is going to make this happen. And he has used all the tools of our time at his disposal.
Tools like the internet and dating apps. Officers discover that Stephen Port had cancelled his Grindr account just hours after the death of Jack Taylor. Why would he do that unless he was hiding something? They discover that he had used Grindr to contact Jack and others. The case against him was building. Whilst on remand, Port began his pen-pal friendship with the ex-con Cody Lackey. The handwritten letters, unknown about by police, were revealing.
Stephen told me in his letters that he met this guy on Grindr. He invited him round to his. They was both taking this drug, GHB, and he said that the guy knew what he was doing. He was administering his own amount of the drug. Then apparently he took a funny turn. Stephen took him outside. I think he rang the emergency services.
Emergency ambulance. What's the address of the emergency?
Cook Street. There was a young boy. Looked like he's capped outside. I don't know.
Said that he found this body outside, but then he put the phone down when he was questioned by the operator from the emergency services.
The telephone number you're calling from. Hello?
They then rang him back. Stephen put the phone down again, and then when the ambulance and police turned up, he scarpered inside.
Port was revealing his version of events about Anthony Walgate. That's not all he gave away in the letters. He was candid about the effects of muscle relaxant drugs, and he seemed to know an awful lot.
He said you can't intentionally kill someone with GHB and stuff because the taste, they'd be able to taste it and stuff because it had quite a sour, like distinctive taste and stuff. But I think he was trying to convince himself more than he was trying to convince me and stuff.
The odd written relationship continued whilst Port was behind bars. In one letter, Port says that all of the men had died because they did not know the dangers of GHB. He even offered to give lectures about the subject when he was released. He said Port was not a killer. He was sticking to a line of defence that even some police officers had believed as the bodies turned up, that gay men were dying because of drugs overdoses, not because of murder.
He said he wanted to become an anti-drug advocate and stuff. He wanted to speak out at schools, colleges, universities, and in the media and stuff. He wanted to get himself a media profile, speaking out against drugs and stuff and the dangers of drugs and highlighting recreational drugs, if you will.
Through his pen pal, Port later perfected his defence. The young man had been inexperienced in how much drugs they should take. They'd overdosed and died. Port had not been responsible for their deaths, which had followed consensual sex. This was not going to be a straightforward case for detectives to gain a guilty verdict.
Might help if I show you a picture. We'll call this CRT 2. This is Jack Taylor. Do you recognise that, mate?
It was during the inquest into one of Port's victims, Daniel Whitworth, that the first breakthrough occurred. The coroner felt that the Daniel Whitworth suicide note lacked authenticity and should be subject to more forensic analysis. One section did not ring true. "Don't blame the man I was with last night."
They told us repeatedly that they had checked it, DNA checked it, sampled it, everything had been done, and that there was no reason for us to look into that. We was also told that all the deaths were not connected, which obviously is not true, because the suicide letter stated that Daniel had supposedly killed Gabriel. So it was connected. We was told there was no connection.
The coroner thought the same. She returned an open verdict. An open verdict means the death was suspicious, but there was no clear cause. Would the relevance of the suicide note expose what really had happened around and in St. Margaret's churchyard? Were Stephen Port's mistakes about to be uncovered? The suicide note allegedly left by Daniel Whitworth, victim number 3, claims that Daniel had been with Gabriel Kovari, victim number 2, on the night that he had died.
And in this note, he expressed not only his sorrow for committing suicide and upsetting his family and his friends by that, but saying that the trigger for it was the fact that Gabriel had died.
The note also urged people not to blame the man who Daniel had been with the night before. Who was that man? Stephen Port.
The apparent suicide note. This was finally submitted to a handwriting expert. And the handwriting expert looked at other things written by Stephen Port, looked at other things written by Daniel Whitworth, and concluded that that suicide note was not written by Daniel Whitworth.
The handwriting matched exactly that of Stephen Port, and more evidence would emerge when other tests were carried out on the note.
And an expert made a statement to say that conclusively the paper that was used for the suicide note for Daniel Whitworth was the same as the paper on which Stephen Port had written his other letters. And crucially and clinchingly, Stephen Port's DNA was found on Daniel Whitworth's suicide note.
The sunglasses found by the body of another victim were tested for DNA. Sure enough, Port's was on them. Still, he protested his innocence.
I mean, Stephen, did you write this letter here, CRT 11?
No, I did not.
The photos of it that's found with Daniel?
No. No.
Yet more evidence. A blue sheet which had come from Port's bedroom and found over a victim's body.
Not only was Stephen Port's DNA found on the Daniel Whitworth alleged suicide note, but Whitworth was found wrapped in a blue sheet, or the blue sheet with him, and Stephen Port's DNA was also found on that sheet.
Are you telling us the truth, Stephen?
I'm telling you the truth, yes.
About the letter?
Yes.
It had taken forensic science to prove that the 4 deaths were linked and that Port had been with all of them, something he tried to cover up with a fake letter. It was the handwriting on that letter which was his undoing. When seen side by side with Cody Lackey's, which the police did not have available to them when investigating, the similarities are particularly pronounced on the letter P.
I mean, the fact is, yes, it's in theory, this was a wonderful plan. And if it had been properly executed and properly he'd taken account of DNA and of handwriting comparisons and all the things that can be done with handwritten notes. If that was all dealt with, this was genius. This was, the stroke of a master criminal.
But Port was no master criminal. His other mistakes were exposed, one by one.
Stephen Port's mobile phone was examined during the investigation, and it was found to contain no fewer than 83 separate video clips of pornographic material, many of which involved a man apparently having sex with another man who was unconscious. It was quite clear that this was something that represented Port's main sexual interest.
The evidence of his internet habits had revealed the full extent to Port's modus operandi. He would lure the men, often in an online disguise, to his flat, having met them via an app, and then spike their drinks with drugs.
Particularly within the gay community, relationships are formed through the use of the apps. It's a ready selection, rather than emerging organically. And really, if you think about it, what Stephen Port has done in selecting his victims is simply an extension of this. He's chosen his victims in the way that in the 21st century, people choose their partners, their relationships.
And then there was the discovery of CCTV linking Port with his fourth victim, Jack Taylor, which first exposed the serial killer to investigation.
And suddenly, that piece that we'd written a year before saying, "Don't worry guys, there isn't a serial killer on the loose," apparently just felt, almost, there's a tragic irony to it because it was wrong.
In November 2016, Port was found guilty of the murder of 4 men. Writing this letter was the killer's mistake, which led to his conviction and a sentence which means he will join the small group of serial killers to have received a whole life sentence. Stephen Port will never be released.
It's just a sexual predator in every which way, and unfortunately it resulted in the deaths of 4 men.
I don't think you can put how much we miss him into words, to be honest. I don't think you can. Any of us. It's just, our worlds have just been squashed. He's a monster. That's all he is a monster. He had no value for life, and he didn't care what he did to boys and what he would do to people's families by what he's done. And being in prison is just too good for him, to be honest, because he's took people's lives and he's destroyed our families for the rest of our lives.